All right, Swagger. So a REST API, REST Representative State Transfer. We talked about that. That was in some guy's doctoral thesis in 2000, 2001. A REST API, what's the API stand for? Application Programming Interface, right? A REST API represents the contract. It's that contract that your application claims it'll support and enforce, right? So we've talked about the front end is just going to, all these people that get all the credit over here are going to take advantage of all of our hard work and consume our API, okay? When they consume our API, we have to give them some documents so they can understand how it works and how it's supposed to work. Well, how do we create this document? How do we make sure that we can pass around our API documentation so that anyone can use it? We can use this great tool called Swagger to do that. Okay. In this lesson, we will talk about the relationship between Swagger and OpenAPI. We'll talk about the Swagger editor. We'll talk about these things that are in the OpenAPI, metadata service, path parameters, request by responses, data definition, refs, those. And then we will actually document a REST API. Here's a little bit of a history lesson. The Swagger specification started in 2010. This is the thing that allows us to have a generalized format for documenting our APIs. Remember this name. You don't have to remember this name. SmartBear Software acquired that in 2015. And they decided Swagger was kind of a dumb name, so they changed it over to OpenAPI. And then all of these big companies are members. That's kind of interesting. Why is that worth noting? These big companies are members. A lot of the way things work, these companies invented. Microsoft, IBM, Google, Facebook, they all invent their own ways of doing things. React came out of Facebook. Web browsing. Web browsing started with, well, a bunch of things. When I was younger, there was an application called Netscape. Does anyone know what Netscape turned into? Firefox. Netscape turned into Firefox. But then Microsoft was like, Netscape, I want to make some money off this, so I'm going to make Internet Explorer. So they made Internet Explorer, and they're this gigantic company. So they made Internet Explorer, and there are all these specifications about how the internet worked. And Microsoft said, yeah, thanks. We're going to do it our own way. And so Microsoft made life hell for web developers for a long time because they decided to implement their own standards and do their own implementations so that now when you're a poor schlep writing this thing, writing the view, taking all the credit for these guys, you have to do one branch of your code that works with most browsers and a different branch of your code that works with Internet Explorer because Microsoft said we're smarter and better than everyone and we're going to do things our own way. Then Google came along and said, actually, Microsoft, we're smarter and better than you, and we're going to actually go back to the specs and implement things that way. So then, all of a sudden, there's this great competition between Google Chrome and Microsoft Internet Explorer and Firefox saying, I'm over here, and Safari saying, I'm here too. And so Google started implementing things that were more in line with the standards, but different than the way Microsoft did that. What's the point of all this? The point is that these guys don't agree on very much, but they agree on the OpenAPI standard. So that tells me that it's a pretty good usable standard. Okay. This is very important. Swagger Editor provides auto-completion support. Let's go take a look at it. Boom. Editor.swagger.io. All right, what's going on with this? This is the output. This is the editor pane. This is the input. When you change this thing, it updates this thing. But look at how nice this is. This is like what we saw with when we were playing yesterday with Postman, we were playing with that, that names, the recres.in. Looks just like this, right? It tells you what your method is. It gives you your path. It gives you a little bit of information about what it does. And this is generated based on this over here. So what does the editor have in it? The editor has all the stuff you need to know what your service is going to do. The things we see on the screen over there, we can see over here in the editor. So all this stuff over here is generated by this code over here. There are a few things. One of them is that there is an open API documentation page that we'll get to later. But you can put all of these things in the editor, the Swagger editor, and it will create this usable output. And this output is the kind of thing that you could pass off to your front end to let them know how to use your API. This language or this format is called YAML. So YAML's got a bunch of key values. You can also do this in JSON. We're going to work with YAML. YAML stands for, are you ready? Very clever people came up with it. Who knows? Yet another markup language. HTML is hypertext markup language. XML, extensible markup language. YAML is yet another markup language. So this is in YAML. We're going to be working with YAML. If I change this over here, so it said Swagger Pet Store. Let's call it the Swagger Pet Emporium. Boom. You can add all this stuff in here. It gives you these nice links when you pass the URLs in. So this is just the documentation of the API. So if your front-end developer wants to create a pet store front-end application, they could add a new pet to the store. So all this stuff is about inventory in general because it's easy to imagine why you would use a web application for inventory. You want to add things to the database. You want to get things out of the database. So this is just the documentation. But if you would pass this off to your front-end developer, and then they would make just a pretty pet store looking application. So this is pretty, right? So this guy, when I go to adopt, not that part, right? All of this stuff comes from some API. Like the reason that these pictures and these names are here, the front end person wrote all pets available for adoption and they made it formatted nicely. And then they've got some code that says, go get me all of the pictures of the cats and go get me all the names of the cats. And then I will display them. And they probably used an API with some kind of documentation here, like this. Okay. Not this one, because that's mine. Find pets by status, get a pet, post a pet. So this is what we pass to the front-end developer so that they know how to use these things. So back to Swagger. So this is the markup, yet another markup language to generate all of this over here. We can change any of these things, like it's like store inventory, if I go look for that guy. Inventory right here. When I change that, of course, changes it right over here. I can change it from a get to a put. Okay. So when you create your Swagger description of your API, you can either store it, you can store it locally, you can load it from disk, you can write it out as JSON, or you can write it out as YAML.
So this just describes the API. You don't even have to create your API. You could start with just the description of your API, and then you can build the Java to work with it. So this is the piece where you've created all of this stuff. You're controlling your model, and you want to tell the view how it works, so you can use Swagger to describe it. Or you can start with Swagger. It's the actual API, but the API, you don't need the API to exist in order to create the documentation for the API. Okay, so we talked about Swagger. Swagger is that thing that we use to document our APIs. We put in our YAML. YAML stands for yet another markup language into Swagger. And then we had our history lesson on Swagger, and we said that Swagger was taken over by OpenAPI. So OpenAPI, right here, 3.x. If there's anything before 3, the 2's that's Swagger, the 3 here is OpenAPI. The OpenAPI spec is the thing that allows us to document our APIs. We talk about, we already saw in Swagger that we've got all this stuff available. So it talks about all of these things and lets you to put lots of information in your description of your API. So we're not going to go over every tiny little bit of OpenAPI. There's plenty to go over. You can read about it. Here's some of the pieces, the higher level bits. We're going to go back and be putting things in our Swagger editor. Metadata, so this is information about the document, right? So it's not actually data about the API. It's more information that describes the document. It's that like next level of data. Not the real data, but the descriptive data. Servers. So the server, the base URL, so that's like the host name, right? www.google.com or facebook.com or amazon.com. So the Swagger editor uses this information to allow you to test your API endpoints. What does that mean?
Pretty cool.
Right. So once you've written your Swagger documentation, one of the cool things about it is you can actually enter some parameters into the Swagger documentation, and it will use the information that you put here in the URLs to actually try out your endpoints. So you can say, ooh, I want to pass a 9 to this book API. And when you pass a 9, it actually makes the call for you and gives you the response and shows you the response. So built right into Swagger. We saw the paths and our endpoints, right? That's like right after the host name. You give it, for example, /books or /API/motorcycles, right? So that's that part in your URL. All right. Within paths, you can talk about your parameters. So parameters, just like in methods, the parameters are the things that you're passing to your API. Query string, headers, or in cookies. You can pass data in any one of those ways. And then your body, so our body is JSON. We'll talk about how you can take a JSON body and translate it into something that you can put in your OpenAPI spec. And the same with the response. And then you can define your data. What type your data is, what allowed values are, what expected values are, also part of OpenAPI.